Underground rock music from the Soviet Union. The singers are Russian, but the boogie-woogie is in English. Known as Russlish, the English language is infiltrating the Iron Curtain from Britain and the United States. Words like rock music, sex appeal, jeansy, hooligan, shoesy, and even disc jockey. Superpower politics divide East from West. But for English, there are no borders. It is more influential than any language the world has ever known. This is the story of English and an English-speaking world. There is only one language for airlines taking off and landing in 157 countries around the world. And that's English.
Hello, Milano. I have for you
English is the universal language of air traffic control.
Coming from London to Fiumicino.
Alitalia 305, buonasera, radar contact, proceed as clear.
Geneva, bonsoir from Alitalia 305.
So an Italian pilot flying an Italian jet into Italian airspace contacts Italian ground control speaking only in English.
Alitalia 305, descend to flight level 130.
Scattered around the world by air travel and tourism, it's estimated that well over 1,000 million people make some use of British or American English every day. Half the world's telephones ring in English-speaking countries. English is used in 75% of telexes and telegrams. And letters and postcards delivered around the world. It's the language of more than half of the world's 10,000 newspapers and of 3,000 publications in India alone. Calcutta, Paris, Athens, Jerusalem, Cairo, Buenos Aires, Tokyo, and Tehran all have English papers. In news, English dominates the world's airwaves, which is why Iranians demonstrate in English. American English is the language of the world's movies. Jazz and pop and rock and roll are all sung in British or American English, even by Swedes or Poles. Over half of a recent European hit parade had songs in English, some of them from Germany. Other valuable commodities like silver, tin, platinum, and titanium are traded in English. And so is the hard currency of information. 80% of the world's computer data is in English. The TV satellites have already begun to saturate the world's small screens with programs in English. It is a language without frontiers. Ironically, English, the world language, is still alien to parts of the British Isles. On Barra, in the Scottish Hebrides, the first language is still Gaelic.
Most people here in Barra speak Gaelic. I speak Gaelic. All my family at home speaks Gaelic.
This castle is the ancestral home of an old Scottish family, the Clan MacNeil. My name is also MacNeil, Robert MacNeil. My branch of the clan left Scotland 4 generations ago and settled in the United States and Canada. I was brought up in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and educated in Canadian schools. The way I speak English is a product of that background, modified by 30 years as a journalist in Britain and the United States. Like the people of Barra, people throughout the British Isles, in North America and around the world, we all speak varieties of English determined by our backgrounds. That's the word we try to use in this series, variety, not dialect, which is often a loaded word. Our story is not about the correct way to speak English, but about all the different varieties and how they came to be. Why a MacNeil in Nova Scotia sounds different from a MacNeil here in Scotland, or one in North Carolina, or New Zealand. Varieties of English are as old as the language itself. In fact, the idea of a correct or proper way to speak is surprisingly recent. There is such an idea, of course. It's often referred to as the Queen's English, or BBC English, or Oxford English, or public school English.
Awake my soul, and with the sunrise it is day.
Public school English is barely 100 years old.
Shake off the soul, and joyful rise.
It first echoed round the playing fields of schools like Eton, Harrow, and Winchester. In Victorian England, these boarding schools took boys from many backgrounds and gave them the same accent.
You had a kind of unnatural segregation of a subset of the people of the country, the very people who were going to become the most powerful. Because of their position of power, they were the basis of imitation. They were eminent and eminently imitable, as it were.
The presumed superiority of this accent lingers. Research in Britain shows that people using this accent are thought more intelligent, more trustworthy, even better looking. Its influence is declining, but the inculcation of public school English still goes on in schools like Winchester.
Well, I think anyone who does have a particularly fringe accent, who's right on the borders, would firstly be sort of persuaded gradually to conform with everybody else. And if he didn't, he'd be ostracised, put out, and people would go out of their way to be unpleasant to him, I think.
When I first came here, I had a working class accent, and thus I was sort of, after a while, I was ridiculed. But you can gradually change your accent, and so that dies away.
Undoubtedly, the English public school has had an enormous influence on the dissemination of one variety of English, what I call a super dialect, that is, received standard or B.
"2,000 years ago, on the shores of northwest Europe, lived a tribe called the Anglii, ancestors of the English-speaking peoples. The Roman historian Tacitus said they were one of 7 tribes who sacrificed to the goddess Mother Earth by drowning people in bogs. In Denmark, more recently, The descendants of those people, digging for peat, have made some remarkable discoveries. Victims of these tribes have been perfectly preserved in the bog. This man was strangled. This man's throat was cut. It's hard to imagine that the language of this savage people would one day become the most widely spoken in the world. A Hindu temple might seem a strange place to start the story of English. But chanting in the holy language, Sanskrit, these worshippers are closer to English than you might imagine. Our word divine resembles their word deva. The surprising connection between English and Sanskrit was discovered at the end of the 18th century by a British judge stationed in Calcutta, Sir William Jones. Jones found that the English father resembles the Sanskrit Pita, the Greek pater, and the Latin pater. Other basic words like mother, three, me, new, and seven convinced Jones that they were all part of the same language family. Perhaps as old as Stonehenge, the prehistoric origins of what Jones called this common source are as remote and obscure as this Neolithic ruin. This common source is the parent of what scholars call the Indo-European group of languages. Reaching out as far as India and the Hebrides, it's given us European languages like Latin and its descendants French and Spanish, the Celtic languages of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, the Slavic languages of Russia and Poland, and the Germanic tongues like Danish, Dutch, and English. The Indo-Europeans probably lived in Central Europe. Gradually, the Germanic tribes, the ancestors of English, moved westwards. Eventually settling along the shores of Northern Europe, they included the Jutes, Angles, Saxons, and Frisians in what is now Denmark, Germany, and Holland. Today, there are still 300,000 Frisian speakers in northern Holland. Martin Sittema speaks a language that is often closer to English than Dutch, closer still to Old English. It's so close there's even a rhyme that works in both languages. It goes, good butter and good cheese are good English and good Fries. Most people associate Friesland with cows. They might be surprised to know that Frieslanders use the same word.
Dat is cow.
And the words for bread or lamb.
Dat is a lamb.
And for wheat, sheep or goose.
Dat is een goose.
And ox or foal.
Dat is een vale.
And how about house or boat?
Dat is een boot.
And similar words for fork, bull or pole.
Dat is een peel.
And corn or dung.
Dat is een tonge.
And green or rain.
Dat is rein.
And even a cup of coffee?
Een kopje koffie.
The English language arrived in Britain in AD 449. The invading Frisians, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes spoke closely related languages, which came to be known as Anglo-Saxon. In the words of the chronicler, Angles and Saxons came from the east. Across the broad sea, they sought Britain.
Sydd an eastan hyder, engle an Saxa uppbekommen, offer brade brimmu, brutunu sochton.
Proud warmongers overcame the strangers. The mighty earls conquered the land, eager for glory.
Ulanke wismidas, welchas offer komen, earles archwate, arde bejeatan.
Britain had recently been abandoned by the Romans, leaving the Celtic inhabitants to look to their own defenses. Portchester was part of a defensive chain built by the Romanized Britons because of the growing frequency of Saxon attacks, so frequent that this coast came to be known as the Saxon Shore. Perhaps the most successful resistance to the Anglo-Saxons was mounted by one Artorius, the legendary King Arthur. But in the long run, the Anglo-Saxons were unstoppable. In the bloody wars that ensued, the native Britons were driven into the forests and hills of the West. There was so little cultural contact that English, which is borrowed from virtually everyone, took fewer than a dozen words from the original Britons. The final insult was that the Anglo-Saxons called the people they had conquered the Wilas, meaning foreigners, from which we get Wales. The names of Celtic rivers, Avon, Thames, and places like Kent and Dover have survived. And a few words for unfamiliar landscape features like Coombe for valley and Crag for high rock were borrowed by the invaders. When the Anglo-Saxons invaded, the Celts fled in many directions to Ireland, France, and to Wales. The Celtic Britons were also part of the Indo-European language tree. Echoes of their language are heard in modern Welsh. The Celts who fled from Britain to France called their new homeland Brittany. Jean Leroux is a Breton-speaking onion seller from Brittany who still makes an annual visit to Wales. Breton and Welshmen speak varieties descended from the same Celtic language. Even today, these Celtic cousins still use words that are common to both languages.
Inpin. Inpin, iawn. O, mae'n fawr, Dew. Inpin. O, diolch yn fawr, Dew. Oel fo. Wyl nawr, de. Wyl chi blwyddyn nesaf. Diolch yn fawr.
Another Celtic tradition is the making of coracles. Peter and Ronnie Davis prefer to discuss their ancient craft in Welsh, and when they speak English, it's with strong Welsh accents.
My family's been fishing with coracles for about 300 years. Well, you just can't pick it up at once. For somebody who doesn't know anything about it, it always turns round and goes round in circles. Well, the net we use, you see, has got rings across the top and a rope going through them. So when a fish hits the back of the net, we just close the net, pull the rope and it closes and the fish is in the bag then.
Maar door de gel, man. Die zijn gel. Maar dem fish.
The characteristics of the English spoken by the Welsh are the rolled R, the clear vowels, the hesitant consonants, and the lilting inflections. All this makes up the music of Welsh English.
So when you finish the shot you're doing, you can carry it back, and it's used because of the lightness of the craft to carry it back. But I'm not making them all the time. I enjoy making them, that's all. I make a couple every year. Just to keep the tradition going of a coracle.
Celtic Wales was united with Anglo-Saxon England in the 16th century. Today, the country is officially bilingual. This Celtic past influences the writing of Eluned Phillips, twice winner of the Eisteddfod crown for poetry.
You can always tell when a Welshman is writing in English because of the flamboyance of their descriptions as a rule. I think that comes down from the Celt, because the old Celtic warriors used to go into battle not only with terror in their veins, but with red-hot waves of ecstasy. And I think that comes out clearly in the writing, in the Welsh English writing.
For generations, the Celtic languages have been fighting for survival in France, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. That survival is threatened by English. Only 20% of the population now claim Welsh as a first language, and most of them live in the country. There's no escaping the Welsh need for English to get on in everyday life. Even this sheepdog, Vic, has been trained to answer calls in Welsh and English to increase his market value.
Good dog. Vic, get away. Get away.
But although the extinction of Welsh has often been predicted, it survives, a lingering reminder of Britain's Celtic past. The Welsh language survives because more than 1,000 years ago it was excluded by the Anglo-Saxons, who built this defensive ditch along what became the border between England and Wales. It symbolizes the gulf between the Celtic and Anglo-Saxon cultures. In England itself, the invaders settled into several kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, Kent, and Wessex, dividing the country along accent lines which survive to this day. The Saxon settlement provided English county names: Essex, Middlesex, and Sussex, for East, Middle, and South Saxons. It's the language of Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons, that is still studied today. Of course, we no longer speak Old English, and it's often taught like a foreign language. But when you listen to it spoken, it doesn't sound foreign. It sounds oddly familiar.
Uchtere was Hvalhunter.
Uchtere was Hvalhunter.
He was Swedish-spedig man.
He was Swedish-spedig man.
He was med dem första männen on dem lande.
He was med dem första männen on dem lande.
On dem lande whereon finnas.
On dem lande whereon finnas.
There finnas whereon fisheras and fugleras.
There finnas whereon fisheras and fugleras.
Ach Uchtere was Hvalhunter.
Ach Uchtere was Hvalhunter.
That land is Helgoland.
That land is Helgoland.
With overtones of modern Dutch and English, and especially German, Old English has familiar Germanic words, like König for king and Sprach for speak.
Zu König Athelbert and Wilde Augustine.
And sprach with hine dat he thou walde.
Anyone who knows modern German will understand the basic principles of Old English. and its structural difference from the English we speak today. The Old English for the king is Sir Koning. Of the king is Thas Koningus. To the king is Tham Koninga. It's the endings which convey much of the grammar in an inflected language like Old English, not the prepositions. Take a simple Old English sentence like, the king meets the bishop. Sir Koning metteth Thona bishop. Here, Sir Koning is the subject of the sentence. Thona bishop is the object. It's the form of the words, not word order, which give the sentence its meaning. In fact, if you change the word order, the meaning of the sentence remains the same. Thona bishop metteth Sir Koning still means the king meets the bishop. Dr. Christopher Page of Oxford University has studied the music and poetry of the Anglo-Saxons. He points out that much of modern English comes from these first invaders.
Many of the basic tools of our language, words like the, this, that, I, me, him, it, those are Anglo-Saxon words, which means that although we've lost a lot of vocabulary, in any passage of English, the density of words of Anglo-Saxon origin is likely to be quite high. And it's possible to construct sentences, without particularly trying hard to do so, in which every word is of Anglo-Saxon origin.
Page illustrates his point with a simple story of West Country life. Every single word you will hear is directly descended from Old English, as Page's translations show. The story is read for us by a forest ranger from the West Country named Edwin George.
Deep in the heart of the old Saxon kingdom of Mercia lies the small hamlet of Butnogue. Deer and other game thrive in this wooded land.
Or, as they would have said in Old English,
Innan woodigan land.
I lived and worked here all my life.
On life minum ean.
Towards the end of each year, I have to kill some of the deer which feed on the leafy shoots and brambles at night.
On leafum, on bremlum, on nichte.
About 90% of our commonest words come from Old English, words like through, look, and slowly. Edwin's West Country accent also retains many echoes of Anglo-Saxon speech. He says book for buck, and he sounds his R's.
Before the sun is I walk.
And he sounds his R's.
Before the sun is I walk by fields and meadows.
Vervelden und meeren.
Where horses, cows and sheep sometimes graze.
Horse, koe on sheep.
I go into Whimperhill Woods, ford Dowell's Brook, and find the deer.
Deer on Fiendam.
I follow them up a hill.
Thorhildeshof.
I walk very slowly now, so as not to frighten the game.
That deer a furchtan.
And look out across a glade.
Thorchthono wuddu lokjan.
Carefully sighting a buck.
Bukkan seo.
I shoot.
It shot ya.
The buck falls to the ground.
Bukka ferleth on grunde.
There will be a great deal of meat for my wife and children today.
Wiffe on childum today.
The Anglo-Saxons were an agricultural people and mostly illiterate. But they had an ear for the music of the spoken word, and they loved to recite poetry in the mead halls after feasting. Christopher Page believes that an Old English vernacular masterpiece like Beowulf might have sounded something like this. Like many epics, it is full of metaphor and alliteration. The sea becomes a whale road, and the poet writes, "Falling has felled a flowering kingdom."
It reveals a reflective and ruminative temper of mind, a mind keenly, almost obsessed with the transience of life, with heroism, with being dignified in the face of defeat and hopeless combat.
Just off the coast of Northumbria is Holy Island, the site of the monastery of Lindisfarne. The conversion of England to Christianity was a cultural revolution which gave the language some of its incredible richness and power. The monks who illuminated these manuscripts here at Lindisfarne found their vocabulary enriched by gospel words from Latin and Greek. Words like altar, angel, martyr, and psalm. But in the year 793, this flowering of Anglo-Saxon culture was cut short by a second great invasion. This is how the beginning of the Dark Ages was recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. There were terrible lightning storms.
There were ormete ligraskas.
And fiery dragons flew through the air.
And whereon je seon a furna drachen nonnam lufta fleogende.
Heathen men sacked God's church at Lindisfarne.
Heden ramanna hergung a dilligod, Goddes kyrkan, in Lindisfarne.
The Danes came year after year. By 870, all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had fallen. The English had been driven back to a small corner in the southwest, their language faced with extinction. The young King of Wessex in the south was England's last and only hope. He, of course, was Alfred the Great. Reduced to hiding in the marshes of Somerset with a small band of followers, Alfred showed brilliant leadership. He raised a new army and won a stunning victory over the Danes. By defeating the enemy from the north and bringing peace to the south, Alfred saved not only his own kingdom, but also the English language. Now he set about uniting his people by appealing to a shared sense of Englishness. He commissioned the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and encouraged the use of English for writing as well as speech. His achievement was unique in Europe. And he is called the Great, an honor given to no other English monarch. England became divided along lines that are with us still. Alfred and his heirs ruled in the Saxon south. The Vikings settled north of a line agreed by treaty in the Danelaw. To this day, the north of England is richly carpeted with thousands of former Viking settlements. Even the fishing huts on Holy Island recall the shape of the Viking longships that, according to the chronicles, darkened the lives of the English with slaughter. The evidence of the Viking is everywhere, but one puzzle remains. Despite Viking rule, we know that Northerners speak English, not Danish, even though their countryside is still scattered with Norse names. The evidence of the Viking is everywhere, but one puzzle remains. Despite Viking rule, we know that Northerners speak English, not Danish, even though their countryside is still scattered with Norse names. 1,000 years later, near York, in the middle of the old Danelaw, the postman still delivers letters to places of Norse origin. Many of the names are based on simple Viking words. Toft for a plot of land, as in Lowestoft. Thwaite, meaning a clearing, as in Micklethwaite. Thorpe for a settlement, as in Gowthorpe or Ewelthorpe. He passes the beck, Viking for stream, into a village called Kirkby. By means a farm. Kirkby means the farm by the church. Today, the postman is visiting a farmer of Norse descent named Erwin Bealby. The postman speaks with a typical Yorkshire accent.
Hello, Erwin.
How are you? How are you?
Very well, and yourself?
No, but middling. I don't like this cold weather.
Erwin Bealby speaks a much older and stronger Yorkshire variety of English.
What have you brought me this morning? You seem to have a fairish load of stuff.
Yeah, well, there's a variety in there.
But this feels like a bake. Aye, well, I'll let you up meet and see, shan't I? Anyhow, I'm middling a walk to the Harry, so I'll let you get on. See ya. It's very difficult talking folks' dialect because they don't know what you're talking about. I mean, you've only to take village that I live in. And there's that many fresh folks come to live in, come out at towns, you know, and what we call off-cumdens. And the grand folks, but of course there isn't jobs for folks around. Here, and they go to work at towns, into city, into York. And of course, if you were to talk to them in dialect, they wouldn't know what in the world you were talking about.
Erwin Bealby's conversation is riddled with Viking words like adel, meaning to earn.
You're going to do a job because you want to earn some money. You want to adel some brass, as we would say in Yorkshire. Mun, it means you must. And laup, well, it means to jump. Laup out the yacht, jump over the gate. A stoup is a gate post, you see. Well, her bag is the udder of a milking cow, milk cow. To tame is emptying, pouring or anything, you see. You tame your bucket into its sile. It's a strainer, is sile. You sit on a little three-leg steel and get your head stuck into the odd cow's side. By God, it was a grand job on a frosty morning.
Erwin's surname, Bealby, is Norse, but he actually lives in Bolton, which is Anglo-Saxon. Names ending in ton, like Malton and Pocklington, are typically Saxon. So are place names ending in wick, ing, ford, and borough, as in Pulborough.
I tell you, Mr. Vaughan hasn't got a lot of...
Like the Viking names, Anglo-Saxon endings are also descriptive. Tun was an enclosure. Ham was a town. Stead meant a site. Stow, a place, often religious. And wold meant a hill. Both the Anglo-Saxon and Viking place names of the Danelaw have traveled across the English-speaking world to places like Scarborough in Canada, Derby in Australia, to Boston in America, or Wellington, New Zealand. Here in Yorkshire, the postman's mixed bag is a clue to what happened to the language in England when Viking and Saxon lived side by side. Professor Tom Shippey is a Yorkshireman who is fluent in Old Norse and Old English. He has studied what happened when the two languages came face to face.
We're up here where Wharfdale meets Langstrothdale. It's a very mixed area linguistically. You get pure English names like Buckton, and pure Norse names like Starbottom. And you get mixtures like Kettlewell or Hubberholm or Jochensthwaite. It's so mixed and they're so close to each other, it makes you wonder what language they were talking in this valley back there 1,000 years ago when the Norse were beginning to come in. Consider what happens if Jochen's son from Jochensthwaite, call him Rap, comes down the valley and decides to marry an English girl from Buckden, call her Edith, and they decide to set up home over there near Hubberholm. Rap's a Norse speaker, Edith is an English speaker. What language are they going to talk in the farm? It could get very awkward, to use a Norse term.
And then suppose that Rap and Edith want to buy a horse for their cart. In Old English, cart was wain, from which we get the traditional hay wain.
Rap, who is Norse, who is a husband, that's a Norse word, and his wife Edith, wife being an English word, they have a neighbour, comes from Buckden, and he's English, and he's called Edgar, and he decides to sell Rap a horse. And Edgar comes up to Rap, and he says to him, in English, "It's willa they sellan, that horse, they drageth me no wine." Now Rap, if he was going to say that, would say something rather similar. He would say, "Ek mun selja there, crossit, sem dreger vogen min." Now, Rap and Edgar have no great problem here on words. Rap says wagen, and Edgar says wine. Rap says cross, and Edgar says horse.
Rap and Edgar's confusion is essentially based on one thing. It's all a question of word endings. Rap says crossit for one horse, but crossin for two horses. Edgar says that horse for one horse, but the horse for the plural. It's all a question of word endings. Rap says crossit for one horse, but crossin for two horses. Edgar says that horse for one horse, but the horse for the plural. And it's very striking that what modern English has decided to do about it is to drop the whole problem. Instead of having all this that, the, in, it business, we just say the for everything. We don't attempt to change it at all. And similarly, when it comes to plurals, instead of having a system, as you had in proper Old English, where you said stan, stanas, horse, horse, ship, shippu, boke, beach, we scrap the whole thing and we say stone, stones, horse, horses, ship, ships, book, books. So when Viking and Saxon met face to face, English achieved the first of its great simplifying compromises. After the expulsion of the Celts, it was one of the most significant steps in the evolution of modern English.
Well, there's an irony in all this, I think, and the irony is this. If you looked round in the year 1000 and said, where are the centres of power for the language, you might say it's in London where the king is, or it's in Winchester where they have the trained scribes and the people writing manuscripts. But actually, the place where the language was developing in the direction that was going to be modern English was places like this. The ancestor of modern English is created in places like Wharfdale.
Shippey's argument that English not only survived but triumphed is supported by some persuasive evidence here in Kirkdale, North Yorkshire. In about the year 1000, some Viking settlers set about repairing this little church. In the porch is a sundial. The man who commissioned the work has the resoundingly Viking name Orm Gammelson. But on closer inspection, his inscription turns out to be in Old English. Barely 100 years after his people invaded, Orm Gammelson is writing in the language of his former enemies. The power of English to stand up to invasion, war, and social upheaval faced the supreme test in 1066. Harold Godwinson was to be the last English-speaking king for nearly 300 years. The third and most famous invasion in this story began in France. Duke William of Normandy assembled a fleet and launched his forces across the Channel. In the words of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, then William, Earl of Normandy, came to Pevensey.
Daar kom Wilhelm, Earl of Normandy, into Pevensey.
Harold the King gathered then a great army.
Harold the King gathered daar mikkel na here.
William came against him unawares before his people were assembled.
Wilhelm him kom onjären, unwär, his folk gefulked were.
There was slain King Harold and many good men, and the French wielded power over that place of slaughter.
There werd slagen Harold the King, and felle godre man, and the Frankiskan achton, well stoer je world.
The word castle comes from French. The word castle comes from French, and this was now the language spoken by the Norman knights in their English strongholds. As one chronicler put it, when England fell into Norman hands, they spoke French as they did at home.
Dus komen do Engelande into Normandies hande, and no Normans ne kuthe speker do botter ure Sveitje, and speker French as they do at home, and their children did also teach.
William tried to learn English at the age of 43, but was too busy to keep it up. Many Anglo-Norman kings were often totally ignorant of their country's language. Edward III could use English only for swearing. Government, law, and administration were conducted in French, and so was the English Church. In the great cathedrals like Durham, the Normans slowly purged the English-speaking bishops. Next to French, Latin was the language of clerks and clergy. In the year 1155, the English monks who wrote the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle abandoned their work forever. Going by the written record, English seems to have become obliterated. But some scholars, like Michael Clanchy, challenged the view that Anglo-Norman society was wholly French-speaking.
Scholars have perhaps been misled because we are taught and learn to respect writings, and of course that is what has survived, these masses of writings, whereas speech has been lost.
There's good evidence here, says Clanchy, that the Normans became quickly integrated into English society.
A contemporary of around 1180 says that by that time the Normans and English were so intermarried as to be indistinguishable.
Imagine an Anglo-Norman knight living out in the English countryside, far from the influence of the French-speaking court. He might have married an English wife. Their children would grow up speaking English. Their nursemaids would probably speak English. Out in the fields, his serfs could speak only in English. In the local monastery, the monks would speak English, and so would the humble parish priest. Clanchy can demonstrate, in fact, that by 1250, Anglo-Norman children were learning French like a foreign language.
You can show from 1250, from a knight called Walter of Bibsworth wrote a book designed for English-speaking people to show them how to speak French. And so French was a language which educated people could speak, but I think it was, by and large, a learned language.
The surviving sermons and prayers show that in some ways English had remained largely unchanged. 100 years before the Norman invasion, the Lord's Prayer sounded like this.
Ure Fader, du de art on Heofanum, si dine name hier halgod.
200 years after the invasion, the Lord's Prayer sounded like this.
Ure Fader, that art in heavens, hallowed be thy name.
Clancy has found startling new evidence that English didn't die out as a written language. This document contains the first known example of written English in a government document after the conquest. In the old script, the word looks like Hamlet, but it's actually nameless, meaning pointless. The French of the castles and the Latin of the churches did not touch the structure of English. But the Normans did have a huge impact on its vocabulary. The Norman masters contributed a wealth of synonyms to the language. Before the Normans, there was one word, kingly. Now the language was enriched with royal, regal, and sovereign. This capacity to express fine distinctions now became one of the hallmarks of the English language. The Norman conquest was a linguistic blessing in disguise. From its French overlords, English acquired a rich variety of new vocabularies for art, learning, medicine, and high fashion. In the law, French supplied virtually all the commonly used terms: felony, assault, larceny, perjury, plaintiff, defendant, judge and jury, even attorney. The same was true for the monarchy, the church, and the military, all areas of power and authority. So great, indeed, is our debt to the Normans that a mischievous Frenchman once suggested that English should be known as a dialect of French. English gained a staggering 10,000 new words from the Normans. These twin traditions, Saxon and Norman, have given us a vocabulary at least twice as large as French, Spanish, Italian, or German. So anyone who writes and speaks in English has a vast menu of words to choose from. Sir Walter Scott pointed out that a medieval banquet could be described in a whole alternative vocabulary. Chicken could be poultry, deer could be venison, sheep could be mutton, calves could be veal. To this day, the use of French words has a certain snob value, suggesting sophistication or savoir-faire. The structure of the language was changing too. Sir Koning is now the king. Thus Koningus is now of the king. Tham Koninge is now to the king. So the first big difference between Old English and this emerging Middle English is in the use of prepositions, words like of and to, instead of word endings. Without word endings, word order becomes crucial. The king meets the bishop. Change the order of these words, and you change the whole meaning of the sentence. The bishop meets the king. This was the English, Frenchified and Latinized, spoken around the year 1350 by the courtiers, merchants, and scholars of the capital. They gave this prestige variety an automatic superiority, the beginnings of standard English. And here we see them listening to perhaps the first great writer in English literature, Geoffrey Chaucer, author of the Canterbury Tales.
Here beginneth the book of the Tales of Canterbury. One that April with his surest sorter the drucht of March hath persed to the rota, and bathed every vine in sich liquor, of which virtue engendered is the flour. Then longen folk to go on pilgrimages.
Chaucer is one of the writers of genius on whom English has always depended for its imaginative breakthroughs. He wrote about all classes of men and women, the knight, the priest, the prioress, and the wife of Bath. Chaucer was alive to the potential of English. He pokes fun at Yorkshire accents. He dazzles the reader with wordplay. Chaucer was alive to the potential of English. He pokes fun at Yorkshire accents. He dazzles the reader with wordplay. And he mocks the pretensions of people who claim to know French and Latin. Chaucer was the first English writer to be buried in Westminster Abbey. It's ironic that Chaucer's tomb is inscribed in Latin, because he is the first writer of genius in our story who consciously chose the English language as the medium for his inspiration. In his early years, according to the fashion of the day, he had worked in Latin and French. It was a bold, almost avant-garde decision to write in English, and his success gave a new authority to the mother tongue. Listening to recordings of Chaucer's English, we can hear that though the vocabulary is essentially the same, the pronunciation is still different.
I'd stand by, studio, and we'll try a take. Line 180, please, Mary.
Okay.
Can we start from there? There was also a nun. Take it quite steadily. Okay, whenever you're ready.
Okay. There was also a nun near, prioress, that of her smiling was full simple and coy. Her greatest oath was but by Saint Eloi.
The first one is the word nun.
Mm-hmm.
And the vowel sound at this time must have been so it should be there was also a nun.
A nun.
A nun.
There was also a nun, a prioressa, that of her smiling was full simple and coy.
Well, that was needs to go last. It's not
More
was. Yes.
That of her smiling was full simple and coy. Her greatest oath was but be Saint Eloi. And she was clept Madame Eglantine.
She, of course, should be she. The vowel in he and she is an A, not an A. She.
She spake full fire and fetisly, after the school of Stratford at Boa.
I think that's very good, Norman.
Indeed, it's pretty good, yes.
So it's Mary next, please.
There was also a nun, a prioress, that of her smiling was full simple and coy. Her greatest oath was but be Saint Eloi, and she was cleped Madame Eglantine.
The father of English literature stands at the head of a great tradition, which includes many of the writers honored here, especially men like John Dryden and Samuel Johnson, and of course, William Shakespeare. As it happened, some 75 years after Chaucer's death, it was right here within the precincts of Westminster Abbey that the man who published much of Chaucer's work, England's first printer, set up his press. And that was William Caxton. This is Caxton's own work. The first page of the first book ever printed in the English language. Here in the Weald of Kent, Caxton's birthplace, Graham Williams is a printer in the same tradition. He works with the Caxton-style hand press, and also the laborious pen and ink method replaced by the printing revolution, a cornerstone of the Renaissance. He imagines that Caxton was a rather contemporary character.
I think he was a remarkably good businessman. That was his training. That's really what his life was about until he was about 50 years old. I think in his day he was probably a very modern man. I think he would have had an eye to moving up the social ladder just a bit, and I'm quite certain that he was looking at the new technology. He would have dealt with books that were handwritten, suddenly printing came along, I think it must have intrigued him. The idea of multiplying copies.
But when the first printing press began to roll in England, Caxton faced a problem. In an oral culture, the few who could write tended to spell as they spoke. There were variant spellings for almost every English word. Besides, there were at least 5 distinct varieties of English, an evolution of the Old English language map. In the north was Northern English. In the south, the English of Alfred the Great's Old Kingdom. In Kent, there was the separate variety of the southeast. The Midlands were divided east and west. This is remarkably similar to the Saxon map, and it still holds good today. Within the East Midlands itself, one small nucleus of power, trade, and learning shared the same kind of English. The triangle formed by Oxford, Cambridge, and London is the basis of standard English in the 20th century. When it came to setting Chaucer in the new type, Caxton had to settle for one system. Naturally, he adopted the vocabulary and spelling of the capital, London English. Like all his contemporaries, Caxton himself was an idiosyncratic speller who wrote as he spoke. This is his spelling of girl. Words like right reflect the pronunciation of the time, richt. And so does plough, ploch, a word that even Caxton spells 2 different ways. The English language owes its chaotic spelling conventions to this simple fact, that printers like Caxton fixed the language on the page before a consensus had emerged among its writers and teachers. It was around Caxton's time that English pronunciation went through its last great change. By the late 15th century, English is almost totally recognizable in the mouths of the first professional actors. You could, in fact, imagine holding a conversation with them in the street.
Worshipful sovereigns, join voices with us to summon the devil, Tittivulus.
Cleopas, and who should bring him in with a shout?
Tittivulus. 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 Tittivulus.
This is Mankind, one of the most popular plays of the 15th century, in an authentic performance outside the porch of Lincoln Cathedral.
Ego sum dominantium dominus. And me nam is Tittivulus.
Do way. We shall no more over the church steel.
Here, the devil prepares to tempt mankind, a hard-working peasant, to swear an oath of loyalty to the 7 deadly sins.
Oh, the heat is very heavy, I tell you for so. We shall sleep full my belly, though he be my brother.
Farewell, every shon, for ye have done me garm, for ye have brocht mankind. Farewell, every shon, for ye have done me garm, for ye have brocht mankind to mischief and to sham.
Mankind, cum header, and raise your left hand. You shall go to all the good fellows in the country about, unto the good way when the good man is out.
He will, sire.
He will, sir.
There are but 6 deadly sinners. Lechery is none, as might be very feared be us breathless every John. You must go rob, steal and kill, as fast as ye may go. He will, sire.
He will, sir.
Take the money, kick the throtties, thus overfast them. He will, sire.
He will, sir.
Here is a jolly jacket. Woo!
Mankind is a colloquial masterpiece, funny, high-spirited, and original. And the language is at last recognizably English. Emerging from the shadow of French and Latin, it's exploiting the versatility it has acquired during the previous 1,000 years. Highly colored, playful, and self-confident, the English language has come of age. After this triumphant debut, the stage is now set for the English of William Shakespeare and the Elizabethans.